In this video lesson, we'll talk about the beginning of Reconstruction, the different plans that were put forward, and the terms that I'd like you to focus on as we go through this video is Reconstruction, amnesty, radical Republicans, and the Freedmen Bureau. The key questions that we're going to discuss in this chapter are, number one, how do we bring the South back into the Union now that the Civil War had ended and the South had surrendered? The second question is, how do we rebuild the South after its destruction during the war, because most of the fighting had occurred in the South, and so that's where most of the damage had happened. Number three, how do we integrate and protect newly emancipated freedmen? How do we help them start their new lives? And number four, what branch of government should control the process of Reconstruction? Who should be in charge? Who should be calling the shots? Reconstruction is going to begin following the Civil War. And the Civil War, as we already know, had devastated most southern cities and the South's economy. The government had to deal with Reconstruction, and the formal definition of Reconstruction is rebuilding the South after the Civil War. The main concerns that had to be taken into account were, number one, how would the former Confederate states rejoin the Union? Should the North actually be nice to them, or should they be very harsh and punish them because they had committed treason, considered by a lot of Northerners, in leaving and beginning their own country, the Confederate States of America? Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan was called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Another nickname for it was also called the 10% Plan. The 10% Plan speculated that government would pardon all Confederates, except for the very high-ranking officials and those who were accused of war crimes. For example, people who were in charge of the prison camps in the South during that time period. After 10% of those on the voting polls swore allegiance to the Union, the Confederate state could re-enter the Union, which means that 10% of the people in each Confederate state had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union, to the United States again. And once they did that, the state could reapply and be readmitted to the Union. Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia moved immediately to re-enter the Union under these terms. President Lincoln wanted to give amnesty, which meant pardon, all the Southerners who took an oath of loyalty to the United States. And he wanted to reconcile with the South, which means he wanted to treat them nicely. He did not want to punish them. The radical Republicans, on the other hand, that were in Congress, did not want to reconcile with the South. Their plan for Reconstruction is going to be more about punishment and about making the South pay. The radical Republicans in Congress had three main goals. They wanted to make the Republican Party become powerful in the South. They wanted to prevent Confederate leaders from returning to power by being able to hold government positions. And they wanted to get the federal government to help newly freed African Americans achieve political equality, which means the right to vote in the South. Lincoln, who was also a Republican, thought that the radical Republicans' plan was too harsh for the South. And his goal, again, was to bring the Union back together in a peaceful manner. One of the things that was set up under Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was the Freedmen Bureau. Freedmen had followed the Union armies across the South, and now that the slaves had been freed, the newly freed men, in most cases, were war refugees. They did not have homes because they had been slaves and they had lived on the plantation, and that was all that they knew. So the question is, where do you go if you were a slave and now all of a sudden you become free? You don't have any money, chances are you have very few possessions, and you don't have a home to go back to. So where is home? As a result of the refugee crisis, Congress establishes what's called the Freedmen Bureau. This was a public program that fed and clothed the war refugees, helped the newly freed men find work, helped set up schools, hire teachers, and colleges for African Americans. So basically, they were providing the necessary needs for the freedmen to be able to build their own lives: shelter, food, clothing, and schools for newly freed slaves and for poor whites as well. And they also are going to help them try to find family members who may have been displaced or sold away from them in the South. Lincoln, unfortunately, is assassinated a few days after the South surrenders to the Union. So Lincoln does not live to see his plan for Reconstruction put into action. A man named John Wilkes Booth, who was actually a Southern sympathizer during this time period, he was a very well-known actor, very famous like the Hollywood actors of today, assassinated Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater. He was shot on April 14th, 1865, and then he died the following day on April 15th. Basically, John Wilkes Booth shot him because he was hoping that even though the South had surrendered, that the South might actually be able to continue to fight the war if he was able to assassinate Lincoln. In the next video, we'll talk more about congressional Reconstruction, which is a different plan for Reconstruction, very different from Abraham Lincoln's, and we'll look at some very, very different terms as well. Terms like black codes, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, which are all called the Civil War Amendments, and what it means to be impeached. And we'll discuss that again in the next video.